little skeletons. I've got some big news. Weird True Crime is now available ad-free on both Patreon and Apple Podcasts. For just $3 a month, you can say goodbye to ads and enjoy uninterrupted listening. But wait, there's more. For $5 a month, you can join our Discord group, the Chaos Corner Skeletons, and hang out with fellow true crime fans just like you. And if you're feeling extra spooky, become an Ultimate Skelly for $10 a month on Patreon to get access to unfiltered, mostly unedited video episodes. As a big thank you, we will give you a special shout out on the show. Thanks for keeping it weird and supporting us. Bye.
For those of you who listened to last week's episode about Judy Malinowski's harrowing fight for justice against her killer, you're in for a treat this week. If you haven't listened to it, go check it out before listening to today's episode.
We sat down with Jake Deptula and Michelle Locke from Love, Lust, Fear to discuss Judy's case, the signs of domestic abuse, and the legal impact of Judy's testimony. It was a wonderful conversation, and we're happy to share it with y'all. Don't forget to leave us a 5-star rating and review wherever you're listening. It really does help us continue to share important stories like this one. Until next time, stay safe.
And make good choices. Bye.
Bye.
Disclaimer. The information shared on this podcast is intended for entertainment purposes only. It should not be considered as professional advice or a substitute for seeking professional advice. The topics discussed in this episode are dark in nature and may be distressing to some listeners. We will be exploring sensitive subjects including domestic violence, severe fire burns, and murder, which may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is strongly advised. I'm Jake Deptula.
And I'm Michelle Locke.
And this is Love, Lust, Fridays. Here we delve deeper into the topics, themes, and stories featured on Love, Lust, Fear. Today, Michelle and I are thrilled to welcome Gina and Amber, the dynamic duo behind Weird True Crime. Gina and Amber are childhood friends who bonded over their shared love of all things goofy, creative, and spooky. Growing up immersed in the world of true crime, Gina spent Friday nights watching Dateline with her mom, while Amber was hooked on Unsolved Mysteries and Rescue 911.
Now, as moms juggling their love of true crime with raising families, Gina and Amber have turned their lifelong passion to a podcast that's perfect for the fans for the weird, the wacky, and of course, true crime. Weird True Crime covers everything from lesser-known cases and unsolved murders to spooky stories and often offbeat news headlines.
On their show, Gina and Amber covered the tragic murder of Judy Malinowski, whose story is a harrowing example of the devastating effects of domestic violence. Judy was a mother of two who survived unimaginable abuse at the hands of Michael Slager before being set on fire in broad daylight. Gina and Amber, thank you so much for joining us. What was it about Judy's case that made you both want to cover it?
Well, it's a monumental case in legal history. Judy's the first victim to testify against her murderer. And the pain she endured for those 696 days, while all of the odds were stacked against her, is a testament to how strong she was and how important it was for her to set this example for her daughters.
Exactly as Gina said, having the victim testify at her own murder trial was unprecedented. And luckily, there wasn't a law in Ohio prohibiting testimony from a victim of homicide before, they actually passed away. She endured absolute unfathomable pain, but she used her pain to drive her to keep going every single day so she'd be able to help victims in situations that she had found herself in.
This is such a tragic case on so many levels. And because it's rooted in domestic violence, which we talk about on Love, Lust, Fear, on Love, Lust, Fridays, based on all the information that you know and what you've done to cover this case and really dive in and share this with your audience, what are some of the red flags that you picked up on Judy and Michael's relationship?
I think one of the biggest red flags that I noticed at the very beginning was the fact that Judy and Michael had known each other for a decent amount of time. There had been some time where he had gone to prison, and when they reconnected, it was almost instantaneous. He essentially moved in with her, and they were inseparable. For me, that was a red flag. She hadn't been entirely aware of his past criminal history. So she wasn't thinking to look out for anything like that. But him attaching himself to her so strongly, so quickly, the way that he did was the first red flag that I realized.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's inserting himself into her life so fully, so quickly that it's not really giving her a chance to maybe see some of those signs or realize that there might be a danger or a threat there. And not to mention that once he had basically moved himself in with her, he's belittling her, he's talking down to her, he's saying things to her that make her feel less than. And all that does is make her feel worse about herself. And when you put somebody in a situation like that, they feel like they're not really worth anything else and they're not going to find anything better. So they're going to stay there because this is the only person that's going to stay with them when they have these quote unquote flaws.
Right. No one will love them like the abuser does. And they believe it. They do. They think they can't do any better. When he moved in like that and really took control of her life and started with the derogatory name calling and then the insult. I mean, he started from his path of destruction from the very beginning and just kept belittling her, controlling her, giving her no other escape until she had no choice but escape through drugs. And that's one of the reasons why I believe she relapsed.
Oh, absolutely. And then he saw that as another opportunity to control her, right? Because she relapsed, but she also continuously fought to get sober again. And he would just continue to come back and keep giving her those drugs to keep her under the influence.
Yeah, it's hard to make clear, concise decisions when you're under the influence all the time.
There were so many red flags, and that didn't even involve the more physical aspects of the abuse.
What were some of the little things that ended up escalating into bigger things?
I think the call 911 repeatedly. You wouldn't think that's a big one, but when you get to a race to the phone, to who gets to call 911 first and who gets to pitch their side of the story first, that's really something that people should pay attention to. Because that race to the phone to call 911 and to pitch their story is something that can be absolutely an indicator of the person's true motive. Especially if you're sitting there knowing you didn't do anything wrong. Like I've had a couple cases where both parties, the cops actually testified to this at one of our hearings, that both parties opened cabinet doors into their own foreheads and then raced to call 911 to create the story.
What's different about this case is because Michael, the abuser, as you mentioned, was using the authorities in order to control her. And Michael was savvy enough to craft the narrative that Judy was the issue. So he was already covering his tracks well early into his abuse.
And not to mention that she's got to be worried about her kids, right? If she's the one who calls or if she gets in trouble and she gets arrested, where are her kids going to be? So it puts her in an extra vulnerable position because not only is she dealing with this abuser who's using his control over her and calling the cops to make her look like the bad guy, she's struggling with a drug addiction that he's helping her keep and trying to maintain the ability to keep her kids. So it's a lose-lose situation.
It's a lose-lose. And that's why, people always get to the question of, well, why didn't she just leave? And far too often victims face this dreaded question. It's, well, why didn't you just leave? I mean, Judy's case is a perfect example of it, of unpacking why leaving an abusive relationship is far more complicated than it seems, because it really, really is. According to the National Domestic Violence Hotline, on average, it takes a victim 7 times to leave before staying away for good. There are infinite reasons why someone would have a difficult time leaving. Fear is usually a big one. Leaving a relationship, an abusive one, leaving is the most dangerous time. And so it's really important in those particular cases to work with experts for a safety plan. And those have to be as well thought out as possible. The other problem that really comes is the abuse becomes their norm. They don't know anything else. And they think that that's normal. And that's how all relationships are. Then you run into shame, which is, I'm a smart, intelligent, capable person. How could I let this happen to me? And you don't want to go admit to your family that you were the victim of abuse and that you suffered at the hands of someone. And it's the shame of feeling like a failure, of I let this happen to me. And shame's a huge one. Also intimidated, and that could be financial resources. That could be, if you leave, you're leaving the children with me. Or if you leave, I'm taking custody of the kids and you'll never see them again. If you leave, here's the consequence of that. I can't tell you how often children are used as, I didn't want to leave because he threatened to take the kids away from me, or she threatened to take the kids away from me. And then low self-esteem. If you have lived in fear, abuse has been normalized, then you clearly have a warped self-esteem because of what you've been through, right? I mean, you may have already gone into the relationship with low self-esteem, but an abusive relationship drives your self-esteem even lower. And so all of those types of things can absolutely make it difficult for someone to leave. And it's really easy to say, well, if they just asked, or there is no shame and I would have helped them, but it's just not that easy.
It's not. And something I've also learned through these cases and then personal relationships that I have is a lot of the times these people are in these relationships with these controlling, gaslighty, manipulative people. And then they say, well, why am I the problem? What did I do wrong? And they come to the point where they think that it's their fault, right? So they're the ones to blame. And they apologize and they're asking, well, am I crazy for feeling like I didn't do anything wrong here? What did I do? What should I be doing differently so this person isn't treating me this way? Obviously, I did something to cause this. And you see it all the time. And because of these feelings of guilt, you're also just going to go back to this abuser out of shame because they make you feel like you did something wrong.
She may have been thinking that this is the only man that will tolerate me. I'm an addict. I can't go to anyone else. Basically, she was self-isolating in a way because he was creating this atmosphere that really she was never going to get an equal hand from anyone.
I have to say, Judy's story is really just, and it made me cry for lots of reasons, but the shame that she must have felt falling off the wagon, the shame that she felt knowing that she was in a bad relationship and had no escape. I can't imagine just what a burden that was on her. The fact that she overcame it after suffering those severe injuries showed her resilience and showed that despite what she went through with burns over 90% of her body and enduring more than 59 surgeries, that somehow she let go of that shame, which was to me the victory for her. I mean, it wasn't a victory in the sense that she got to live, but she got part of herself back by doing it. And I do believe that's what helped her live as long as she did, because she took herself back. It gives me chills just thinking about it.
And I mean, it was a miracle that she survived so long based on suffering burns 90% of her body, 59 surgeries. I mean, just unhuman ability to survive. Okay, absolutely against every single odd in the book. Her being able to testify in this way, how much would that testimony weigh based on everything that she's gone through and everything that she's able to share based in the condition? How does a court see that?
Her testimony was, for me, it's a prosecution's best case and a defense attorney's worst nightmare for so many reasons. Quite frankly, I've always talked about when I try cases, I keep it as a KISS method, keep it simple, stupid. If I was a prosecutor in her case, I would have played that video and then put on probably the autopsy and the other things you have to do to meet the elements in the indictment. But what else do you need other than that recording? And from a defense attorney's position, what are you supposed to do with that? The only thing you can do is say, well, she was under the influence, either at the time it happened, and so she didn't remember that she actually caused it to herself. I mean, whatever story they can come up with, or it's she's remembering wrong because of all the trauma she's had. Those are the only ways to attack it. But the problem is, then you run the risk of really making the jury angry because you see this woman who, I mean, completely disfigured. And if you know anything about burns, and I would suspect the prosecutor did this, if you know anything about burns, they are horrific. I mean, horrifically painful. You actually lose liquid from your burns. And so you're constantly dehydrated. And people that are true burn have water literally oozing from them. It's just horrific. The state probably went into some details about that to show how she suffered. I mean, that'd be important for punishment phase for sure. That's the kind of evidence in court that silences a courtroom. And it's deafening silence. I've been in a courtroom when the death sentence is read.
Yeah.
And I've never heard a silence like that ever. I would imagine that when this testimony was played, it was that.
we talk about how there are clues to these situations, right? But one of the problems, and we all know this, is that if you're a victim in these situations, you become an expert in concealing things, right? You survey people around in your environment and whatnot. And we're all pretty open here, but there's also things in our life, I'm sure, that don't come out, and we don't want to make someone feel uncomfortable, or we don't want someone basically telling us what to do. When you go down that path and you look at the isolation and the escalation, even the fact that Judy tried to stay in a hotel just to get away from him, and he ended up finding her a few days later and coerced her into coming home. Michelle, you see these situations all the time.
Listen, I've lived it. And that's why the shame one gets to me, because the shame really keeps you silent. It really does. And there's not an easy fix for that. How do you take away someone's shame? How do you take away that they feel like they're worthless because they let themselves do things they wouldn't have done? How do you fix that? It's only the person that can fix that. And sometimes you're just not capable. That's why I love Judy's story, because she forgave herself and got over the shame. But that shame leads to silence every time.
Actually, Michelle, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Because I feel like there's so many different layers to the word shame, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can be ashamed of so many different aspects of a relationship. You can be ashamed of the fact that it didn't work out the way you thought it would. You can be ashamed of the fact that this person you fell in love with is not who you thought they were. From your experience, what do you think it is that impacts a person in that situation the most? And like, is there something specific that helps them kind of power themselves through to get out of that situation? Or is that something that's hard to get past?
Kind of like how love bombing is. I think people's shame is unique to each individual, because what is so shameful to one person may not have the same effect as someone else. But let's say for 20 years, you've had this image of the perfect marriage and the perfect kids and the white fence and half the stuff we see on Facebook from our friends, right? Like their lives are perfect. And for some of those people, the shame of everyone finding out that it's a farce, that they rent their house, their kids are drug addicts or flunking out of school, that they're about to be kicked out of their house. And I can think of a housewife that's an example of that. But the shame of that would be enough to keep them from ever telling about what's going on behind. And I think for Judy, I can only guess, and it's an educated guess, but I would suspect that her relapse was her like real shame that made it difficult for her to get out, because she had really gotten sober and gotten clean. And if you've worked that hard for something and you completely fall off of it, that shame may have been enough for her not tell her family, because then it's you're a two-time loser again, and no one wants to be that. And that's why, my whole philosophy in life is everyone should get second chances. You never know what someone's been through. You never know what their life experiences are to get them to the point where they're at. And sometimes that grace and just telling them that it's going to be okay and they can get out of it. They can pull forward. They can become better. Because sometimes in life, it just takes one person believing in you to make a difference.
That's really well said. Gina and Amber, based on the research that you've done and everything that we've seen and heard, do you have any better sense of who Judy was as a person, what her dreams were, what she was looking for when it came to a relationship, came to love, support?
She was really wanting to focus on bettering herself and focus on her daughters. With the split, with the scandal that happened with her husband, Ron, she wasn't exactly looking for anything else. She wanted to get through the cancer treatments, survive that, and just make the absolute best life that she possibly could for her two daughters. There was a quote that she had said that I cannot remember off the top of my head, but it was so poetic. It just instantly gives you the sense that her kids were her entire world and they were her focus. She wanted to just make everything possible for her kids.
She was such a hero on so many levels, and the fact that her legacy lives on through Judy's Law. I want us to kind of break down the legal aspects to Judy's case. And Michelle, I want to get your thoughts on these. Judy becoming the first person in Ohio to testify in her own murder trial from her hospital bed. Explain how groundbreaking that this testimony worked and its significance.
Every criminal defendant has the right to confront their accusers. And because it was testimony from the hospital bed, it wasn't quite the same as what I think a lot of people had envisioned as your right to confront your accuser. Also, she's speaking from the grave, which makes it hard to cross-examine. Although if I recall correctly, weren't the defense attorneys allowed to cross-examine her in the hospital room, if I recall correctly?
So, yeah, she recorded a deposition where she had to be slowly weaned off of the pain medicine and had to be sworn in under oath. She was first questioned by the prosecution. It was like over an hour long deposition. And then like the second half of it, the defense was able to speak with her and question her.
And just so you know, an hour-long deposition is not a long deposition. I sat in one for 6 hours yesterday. Did the court limit the time they could ask her?
This is coming from the released video of the deposition that the public was able to see. But I want to say that the deposition actually lasted hours. But what was actually released that you could see and watch and hear was a little over an hour or so.
I think it was 3 hours. And
yes,
the cross-examination was like 2/3 of it.
I watched the documentary on it, and I think people were complaining about the cross-examination because they were really unmerciful. But you've got to be really careful as a defense attorney what kind of questions you are asking someone in that kind of position, especially someone that didn't do it to themselves. I mean, it's not like she lit herself on fire at the gas station, but it's groundbreaking because, like, at least in Texas, we have dying declarations. So dying declarations are an exception to the hearsay rule. And what the hearsay rules, general rule says is you can't use an out-of-court statement for the purpose of the truth of the matter asserted, which in her testimony, it would have been an out-of-court statement, absolutely for the truth of the matter asserted that he did it. So it makes it groundbreaking for that reason in Ohio. And you know, what's interesting to me is that it doesn't seem like it should have been groundbreaking. To me, it's kind of common sense. But, you know, with how the rules of evidence work in different states and how things happen, but something like that should happen. If you've got someone that's dying, yeah, you should be able to take their deposition. But I know, at least in criminal cases, especially in Texas, you have to ask the court, I think, for permission to take depositions. Unlike in civil cases where you can just notice the deposition, say, hey, we're taking a deposition on this date. In criminal cases, you have to go seek the permission of the court to do so.
After Judy passed away, Michael pleaded guilty to aggravated murder and was sentenced to life without parole. His plea agreement stipulated that the death penalty would be off the table. Michelle, how much of an effect did Judy's wishes have on this decision?
When you've got a criminal, the prosecutors typically confer with victims about their desires for punishment before they make plea deals. I think that her wishes had an absolute impact on the prosecutor, because I think a prosecutor looking at that case, to me, like in Texas, that would have been an automatic death penalty case. I mean, it just would have been. It's not even a doubt in my mind that it would have been a death penalty case. That being said, I think it was only not a death penalty case because that's what Judy wanted. I mean, I think the prosecutor took it 100% into consideration when they made the offer, because quite frankly, someone that could do that to her needs to be like drawn up and quartered.
Mm-hmm. I do want to add, though, that Michael wanted to plead no contest. So he wanted to plead, I'm not saying I did it, and I'm not saying I didn't do it. But the prosecutor said, no, if you want this plea deal, you have to plead guilty. And that's why he pleaded guilty, not because he wanted to plead guilty.
Where does this leave us with Judy's legacy? What can we learn from her case, from her situation, and everything that she's gone through, and ultimately everything that she's helped to provide to potentially future survivors of anything that has happened during her life?
The most appropriate takeaway from Judy's case is really her own words, which are, if you're in an abusive relationship, find help and get out completely. Run the other way. Run. I'll add to that, and run as fast as you can. I think that's the takeaway. Get out. It's difficult. It's hard. It may seem impossible, but she got out even after she got burned.
Gina and Amber, what was the one thing that made you both want to cover and explore Judy's life, her case, and ultimately the outcome?
I mean, the woman was set on fire from head to toe, and she survived that. She survived way, way longer than anybody ever expected her to. They actually have a formula for calculating mortality for burn victims. I don't know the exact formula, but they take your age and the percentage of your body that's burned. And her being in her early 30s when she had been burned, and that she was burned over 90% of her body, her mortality rate was 110%. And through sheer determination, this woman stayed alive for 2 years to help bring justice to her abuser and to be kind of this beacon for other women going through her situation. Anytime that we're researching a case, anytime we're looking at stuff, I kind of do a shallow dive, read through basic information. We also want to make sure that there's enough out there to really be informative about it. And in just doing the shallow research into it, one thing that really stuck out to me was burn injuries are horrendous.
They're absolutely horrific.
The recovery, the treatment, everything that is involved with burn patients is just excruciating.
To bring the skin, disinfecting the skin, and
it's constant skin grafts, surgeries.
And it's every day. It's every single day.
We mentioned in the episode that when you're burned, your nerves are exposed. And there is literally no amount of medicinal relief that you can get unless you're knocked out. And she had been in a coma for quite a while. Long story short, the thing that really stuck out to me was after she had woken up from her coma and she saw herself for the first time in a mirror, it had been 2 months since the attack occurred. And she said the moment that she saw herself, she knew she had to stay alive to keep going to help other women. That part, we're not even counting the 2 times that she beat cancer. We're not even going into all of that. It's that. She saw what had been done to her and used that to push herself through something that most people wouldn't have survived a few months.
A day. Yeah. Not to mention that I think they would have had to give her so much pain medication to actually dull the pain that it would have killed her. So she was always in pain. So even when she was on the high doses of medication, she was still in immense pain. And then imagine having to come off all of that over weeks of time to be able to prove to a judge that you're of sound mind to testify. So, the mental strength that this woman had to put herself through all of that just to show her daughters, this is what you do. I'm going to fight and I'm going to stand up for myself in this situation. I'm going to stand up for other women who have been in this situation. The role model that she was for her daughters in that moment. And the other reason why I think this story is so important is if you're not in the situation, if you've never been in a relationship like this, or you don't know anybody who's been in a relationship like this, it's really easy to ignore it or not understand how dangerous it can be.
And don't ever tell someone, why don't you just get out?
Right.
Don't ever say that. No. Don't ever say that. Mm-mm. Your only thing you should say is, how can I help you get out?
How can I help?
Mm-hmm.
Do we know how her kids are now?
They're young adults. They work for the foundation. They do all sorts of advocacy work and everything else.
They must be amazing. And looking back, they have got to know what a hell of a woman their mother was.
Mm-hmm.
So Kaylin is the oldest daughter. When Judy was still in the hospital and they were trying to push Judy's law through, Kaylin actually went before a judge and spoke basically on behalf of her mom to try to help get this. And she didn't want to speak in front of all of these strangers of all, it's a very serious setting too. Courtrooms scare the hell out of me. And she was 13 at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So her mother's influence had already started back then when she was that much younger.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would suspect that Judy is looking down on them and smiling. Y'all are going to make me cry on a Friday. It's already been a crap week. It's like the ugliness in this world that exists sometimes just sucks.
But you know what, though? It's so easy to ignore it and not talk about it because it is ugly and dark and it sucks. But that's where the problem is, right? Because the more you ignore it, the less people understand that it's important and it needs to be talked about and understood, because people need to know what to do in these situations and how to fight.
I agree.
And people that love those people need to know how to help them.
But I think why Jake does what he does is why I do what I do, why Haley does what she does, and why you guys do what you do.
Yep.
What does the future hold for Weird True Crime? How can people get involved? How can people find the show? How can they listen? Can they suggest cases? Are there any things out there that you want to accomplish in this next year?
I mean, there's so many goals we want to achieve, right? Like, of course, we want to work with more families. And we have several families that we're in the process of working with to cover their stories. And these are stories that get no media attention, no police coverage, nobody will touch it. And these are just families that are stuck looking for answers and nobody's willing to help them. And it's so frustrating. And so the fact that they want to come talk to us and so we can provide them a platform to tell their story and get the word out there is so important, because the more that we can talk about this and get it in front of people, it's going to push law enforcement to take action, because they don't like it when other people are calling them out on what they're not doing.
From this standpoint, Haley, can I bring you into the conversation for this real quick? What kind of impact do you hope to make by what you're doing in producing and researching many of these cases in the true crime space?
The main goal is to help families spread awareness of their loved ones' cases. Most of the time I do unsolved, which means that we're helping the public learn about the case or putting pressure on law enforcement or both. But then sometimes I help families with solved cases, like Moms and Mysteries just covered Peggy Klinke's case, which we talked about on last week's episode. I was able to work with Peggy's sister, Debbie. And of course, Peggy's case is solved, but it's a really important one to tell because it talks about stalking awareness and National Stalking Awareness Month and things like that. So that is more about spreading awareness than putting pressure on police, but it's still just as important. And I think that it also gives credibility to the podcast I work for, because we're not just regurgitating things that we find online, which I don't have a problem with that, but we are adding to the story and doing our own reporting. And I really like that aspect of things. And then the other thing that I really like is that we're able to fact check things with families. A lot of the time, the media gets things wrong. So when you work with families, you're able to have them fact check everything. And then you know that the content you're putting out there is 100% accurate. And that also means a lot to families because they want a true narrative out there. And they also want to talk about the things that the media has gotten wrong. I think working with families is the best thing to do. And if people aren't doing that, they should certainly look into doing that, because it is really important for families to have a voice. I mean, these are their stories.
Gene and Amber, you both dive into uncomfortable things in the true crime space, okay? I'm not saying true crime cases are comfortable, but we all know that there's a certain level of the, let's say, the popular or the well-known cases that people gravitate towards because...
there's the shiny ones.
Exactly. This is not one of those cases that is going to make people feel good.
You don't walk away from this case feeling good about yourself or good about civilization. You don't.
You both could have chosen certain cases, certain topics that, let's just say, would have been more lower hanging fruit, more comfortable. But you both dive into things that people not only need to hear, but put them in a position to become very uncomfortable in the true crime space. So I want to talk to you both about that and find out why you decide to choose cases which are a little bit of a more difficult target to hit.
It's important to tell the hard stories. It's important to not just tell the stories that everybody wants to hear, because a lot of the time we know what happened in those. And there are so many families out there that are still looking for answers or justice or trying to find their loved one or fight for their loved one who was murdered 30 years ago and the cops still won't solve it.
When Gina and I are discussing what cases to cover, we have a running list. I'm real big on balance, on having a variety. Advocacy is super important. families of victims, they need help with their voice. They need a platform, and we can do that for them. But there's also these other cases, especially with Judy's case. Yeah, it's uncomfortable as hell to talk about. But what if there is somebody out there that's listening that is thinking, oh God, that kind of sounds like what, my boyfriend's doing to me. It shows them that Judy may not have gotten out the way that she wanted to or that she deserved to, but there was a way for her to get out. I look at Judy's case not as just this tragic, tragic story. I think of it as more of the perfect example of somebody showing unwavering strength and resilience in an impossible situation. Hearing that aspect, hearing that side of these cases can give you hope. It can help you when things just feel absolutely bleak. You can hear somebody else going through something like that, and it can give you hope that, one, you're not alone, and two, there are things that can be done. There are people that are listening.
Thank you for joining Gina, Amber, Michelle, Haley, and I on Loveless Fridays. If you have a dating or relationship story to share or want to participate in a discussion here on Loveless Fridays, DM me on Instagram at lovelustfridays or email me at lovelustfridays@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, sharing, and supporting. Links to guest social media and some content mentioned are in our show notes. If you know someone who's being abused by a partner, there is help available. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. The National Domestic Violence Hotline provides essential tools and support to help survivors of domestic violence so they can live their lives free of abuse. Call 1-800-799-SAFE. That's 1-800-799-7233 or text START to 88788.